Our three panelists are to take it from the top alphabetically. Marwan Muasher, who is, I believe, a VP at Carnegie now, a vice president at Carnegie. He was Jordanian ambassador to the US and Jordanian ambassador to Israel, not at the same time, seriatim, and knows his country's politics intimately, but also knows the United States and Israel quite well. So he's ideally positioned to discuss these issues, which are centered around the 1994 treaty between Israel and Jordan. Secondly, we have Bruce Riedel. He has had significant experience in the United States government in very senior positions. As the Russians would say, he knows where the dog is buried. He not only served at the White House and at CIA, but he was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. So he understands the military side of these issues as well. And of course, there's a substantial military side to the U.S.-Jordanian relationship and to the Jordanian-Israeli relationship as well. Lastly, but with pride of place, because she's QI's own, is Annelle Sheline, who is a research fellow, or just a fellow at QI. She has her PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from George Washington University, and we're very happy to have her on the panel today because she has recently been in Jordan and written a very informative paper, which can be downloaded from the QI website, called Jordan on the Edge, which sums up her visit to Jordan, which was fairly lengthy, during which she interviewed a wide range of individuals from the Islamic Action Front on the one side to members of government and the intelligentsia on the other. So she's really got her finger on the pulse, as of course does Marwan. So that's our cast of characters. I'd like to start out, get the discussion going by asking our panelists about the world of 1994 as against the world of today. What would somebody from today who did not know a lot of history and who was dropped into the world of 1994 that produced the treaty between Israel and Jordan, would that person recognize the world into which they'd been dropped? I'd like to start here with Marwan.
Thank you, Steve. They would hardly recognize that word. Let me give you some numbers. When we signed the peace treaty in '94 and I became Jordan's first ambassador to Israel, the Labour Party in Israel had 40 members out of 100 members of the Knesset. Meretz, the leftist party, had 12 members, and the Arabs had about 10. Just these three parties between them had a majority for peace when we signed the peace treaty. Today, Labour has 4 members, Meretz has 0 members, and the Arab parties are split. That gives you an idea of the constituency for peace that has vanished in Israel. In July of this year, the Knesset passed a law against the establishment of a two-state solution that got the approval of every single Jewish political party in Israel. Netanyahu has called a two-state solution a reward for terrorism. And annexation in the West Bank is actually taking place as we speak, with settlers attacking Palestinians in Area C, with Smotrich announcing that 2025 is going to be the year of the annexation of the West Bank, and with President Trump now calling for mass transfer of Palestinians into Jordan and Egypt. When Jordan signed the peace treaty, it did that primarily to guard against the evolution of such a scenario. That is, the evolution of a scenario that would solve the Palestinian question at Jordan's expense. Today, not just public Jordan, but official Jordan is also asking, why did we sign a peace treaty? If Israel wants to annex the West Bank, if Israel doesn't believe in a two-state solution, and if the US administration now calls for mass transfer into Jordan and into Egypt, what was the peace treaty for?
Well, that's a profound question under the circumstances, Marwan. Let's turn to Bruce and then Annelle. Are you muted, Bruce?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. In addition to what Marwan has noted, 30 years ago, the expectation was that peace was coming to the Middle East, that a deal was in hand. We'd had the Madrid conference, we had the Oslo process moving, there were serious negotiations underway between Israel and Syria. And the irony of all this is, of all the hopes that we had in 1994, only one materialized, the Jordan-Israeli peace treaty. And if that is now in question, then that entire hopeful era that we were on the edge of transforming the Middle East, I hate to use the phrase new Middle East because everybody who's ever used the phrase new Middle East has discovered that the old Middle East won't go away. But there was an atmosphere, a mood in the Clinton administration. You had a president who was willing to devote an enormous amount of personal time, which is the most important thing the presidency has, to these issues. Ironically, and for good reason, the United States was not really involved directly in a serious way in the negotiations that produced the peace treaty. We can come back to that later on. But it was a time of great opportunity, great hopefulness. All that, of course, has gone away with the Second Intifada, with the destruction of the Israeli Peace Party. It's very hard to be optimistic these days about the future of the Middle East.
Thanks, Bruce. Now, just a spin on this question. We've heard how Israel is different to what it was then, and really the United States and its policy priorities were then compared to now. How does Jordan differ now from the Jordan of 1994?
The Jordan of sorry.
Are you muted? Yeah.
I certainly want to hear Marwan's perspective on this, but I think it's also just useful to keep in mind that so much of how Jordan has been transformed in the intervening 30 years has had to do, first of all, with the development of the US-Jordanian relationship, such that after Jordan signed the peace treaty with Israel, Jordan then received significantly more assistance from the United States, economic assistance, but also military assistance, such that then later in the context of the global war on terror, Jordan emerged as a key partner for the United States, especially for the Iraq War, for example. At the same time, as a result of violence in the region, Jordan has had to absorb millions more refugees. So as a result of the US invasion of Iraq, for example, Jordan took in over 1 million Iraqi refugees. Subsequently, violence in Syria, as a result of the Arab Spring, Jordan again took in hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, many of whom still remain in Jordan. Obviously, there's some hope now with the fall of the Assad government that there may be an opportunity for more Syrian refugees to return to Syria, but that's still very up in the air. And obviously right now, the main concern and what we're hearing from the US administration is this idea that Jordan would perhaps again be viewed as the so-called alternative homeland for Palestinians, which is something that Jordan and Jordan's leadership had made very clear that Palestine is for Palestinians and Jordan is for Jordanians. So to get back to this question that Marwan sort of opened with, well, why did we sign a peace treaty in the first place? Because a key provision of the treaty was to agree that Israel would not displace Palestinians into Jordan, and that Jordan gave up its previous claim to the West Bank in exchange for sort of solidifying the status of Jordan as a sovereign country, as separate from Palestine, and that Israel would no longer consider Jordan sort of this alternative homeland. But again, now in this current context where you have a US government considering this, it's very important to keep in mind that not only does Jordan continue to maintain a massive refugee burden, again, often as a result of US military action in the region, but also that Jordan simply does not have enough resources for its own population. Jordan is one of the most water scarce countries in the world. The water scarcity threshold is usually accepted or is held at 500 cubic meters per person per year, and with Jordan is at less than 100 cubic meters available per person per year for their existing population. And so the thought of hundreds of thousands, a million, there are 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. So a question of if Israel were in fact to annex the West Bank, how many of those Palestinians would Israel try to force across the border into Jordan? This is an absolutely existential threat for Jordan. On top of the fact that Jordan's economy already is not strong enough to provide adequate employment for their existing population. And this I'll pause there and let Marwan weigh in, who can speak much more to sort of how Jordan looks different now than it did when the peace treaty was signed.
I want to make some additional points, Annelle. Official Jordan justified the peace treaty to its own citizens by saying that this treaty is going to prevent the establishment of an alternative homeland in Jordan. Later on, with the policies of the Netanyahu coalition, official Jordan once again justified to its own population that once Netanyahu goes, things would become better and the conditions would be more ripe to resume negotiations that would end with two states. Both these assumptions are being proved wrong. The first assumption, that the treaty is preventing the establishment of an alternative homeland, is seriously questioned today, not just by public Jordan, but by official Jordan. And the reasoning it gave its citizens is proving to be weak. The other reasoning that the departure of Netanyahu might bring in a more reasonable Israeli coalition is also proven to be weak after the Knesset passed the law against the two-state solution in July. So official Jordan today is also questioning the relationship with Israel. The other point I want to make is this. To Jordan, this is not a question of bringing in more refugees like, Syrians and Iraqis, who are for sure an economic problem and a security problem. But for Palestinians, they are also an identity problem. Most of these Palestinians in the West Bank were once Jordanian citizens, have relatives in the country. And, bringing in of even few 100,000 Palestinians, if not more, from the West Bank, which has a population of 3 million, is going to change potentially the identity of the Jordanian state. So official Jordan is worried about that. It is an identity question, in addition to it being an economic and a security question. It is also a different kind of question. Is Jordan going to be accused, together with Egypt, as having collaborated to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish state in all of historic Palestine and the emptying of Palestinian land from its own citizens? Jordan cannot withstand that kind of pressure, which brings me to the point that the Trump administration and President Trump's statement today, sure statements that Jordan is going in the end to accept that, I strongly question that logic, because for Jordan, it is not an economic issue. It is not a security issue. It's an identity issue. And Jordan, in my view, will not, under any circumstances, accept the coming in of more Palestinian refugees for the reasons that I outlined above.
Thank you. We're going to come back to these points in a couple of minutes. I wanted, before we did that, though, to explore a little bit of the prehistory of the 1994 treaty, just to get more of a context. I know Bruce offered a couple of minutes ago to return to that era. But in addition to the irrational exuberance of the Clinton years on Middle East peace, there were previous steps on the way, I'd say, stations on the way. The one was King Hussein's 1988 speech, in which he declared that the Hashemite kingdom was severing its ties, severing its claims to the West Bank. Seems to me that that would have been a fundamental precursor to a treaty whenever one was going to come up on the menu of options for the concerned states. And the second was the first Gulf War, in which Jordan played a kind of ambivalent role, or maybe ambiguous role. I'm searching for the right word, but and you all can discuss what that role was. But to what extent was there already a kind of momentum from the late 80s in the direction of diplomatic ties between Israel and Jordan? And to what extent, returning to Bruce's point, was the exuberance in that period irrational? I mean, certainly ex post facto, it seems that way, because we take for granted the role of the spoilers in bringing that process to an end, the peace process of the Clinton years to an end. But was there a sense in 1994 that the Jordan-Israel treaty was kind of a building block of a new future that was presaged in a larger sense by the good feeling, I suppose, and diplomatic progress of the early Clinton years? Let's turn to Bruce first, and then Marwan and Annelle.
There was very much a sense that coming out of the first Gulf War, the United States was not only the only superpower left, but had the power to remake the region. Now, this was delusional, clearly, but it was a very powerful feeling. And it wasn't just Bill Clinton who felt that way. It was I would say the political process in America felt this way. And yes, the Jordan agreement would be, if you like, the first stepping stone, and we would get the rest. Now, it's frequently forgotten that we actually came very close to a second step, which was an Israeli-Syrian peace agreement. We had that literally within 10 yards. If we had been able to come up with an agreement on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, we would have had a deal. And with that deal, you would have also gotten a deal with Lebanon. I remember at Shepherdstown mentioning to Foreign Minister Shara, well, what are we going to do about Hezbollah? And he said, oh, don't you worry about that. We know how to deal with these people. And it sounded as ominous as it still does. In the end, we got none of it. What we ended up with was the second Intifada, and really the destruction of the peace camp in Israel, a great weakening of it in the Palestinian movement, the emergence of Hamas, And I would say for now, as I look at it, from a Jordanian standpoint, the most important part of this peace treaty today is the relationship it has developed between the United States and Jordan, which is infinitely stronger now and more nuanced than it has been in the past, including a great deal of military cooperation and the deployment of American aircraft in Jordan. That relationship is what is at risk if Jordan should, for some reason or another, sever the peace treaty, not going back to war. Correct me if I'm wrong, Marwan and Annelle, but I don't think anybody in Jordan wants to go back to a state of war with Israel. But they may not want to be in a state of a peace treaty with Israel.
Can I probe just a little bit, about that era? From your, you had your foot in two camps, really professionally. The one was you were a White House official and deeply involved in these in the diplomacy that we've been discussing. On the other, you came from a career in the intelligence community with which you kept close tabs. So I guess my question is, was the analytical view in that period as optimistic as the political view during that era?
I don't think it was. It was not, there's no chance, but there was much more recognition of here are the obstacles, and that these obstacles are quite significant. I think there was also much less confidence that the Palestinian leadership, meaning Yasser Arafat, was prepared to make bold steps. Yasser Arafat was the most frequent foreign visitor to the Clinton White House in the 8 years that he was in office. More than any other foreign visitor was Yasser Arafat was there. In my view, President Clinton assumed that Arafat was more interested in a final deal than in fact that he was. That is not to say that Arafat is the evil person in this story, but it is to say that Arafat understood that from a Palestinian standpoint, the issue was not just the question of the status of the West Bank and Gaza. Yes, that's very important. So is Jerusalem, but so was the fate of the Palestinian diaspora and those who wanted to go home. And that issue, there was no prospect of any breakthrough whatsoever. And it's important to understand that Yasser Arafat's base of support in the Palestinian movement in the 1990s was not the West Bank and Gaza. It was the Palestinian population in Lebanon and Syria, those and Kuwait, or formerly in Kuwait. That's where his constituency was. And Camp David, the Clinton Camp David, didn't address those issues. And he was also promised right up until the moment the helicopter flew out of Camp David that no one would blame anyone for the failure. By the time the helicopter landed, everyone was blaming Yasser Arafat.
Yeah. Annelle, over to you.
I just wanted to comment on something Bruce said. I don't think the concern is so much that Jordan is eager to violate the treaty. I think it's more the concern, and this is what I heard from Jordanians, was that they don't feel that they have a partner in Israel any longer. Right. That this current Israeli government no longer sees it as particularly valuable to maintain a peace treaty with Jordan, and that they consider it more in their interest to push Palestinians across the border into Jordan. And then the question is, how would the Jordanian government respond? And I think given that we know that the amount of support that Jordan receives from the United States is fairly significant, although at the moment Trump has frozen all US aid to Jordan, which accounts for about 10% of their national budget. So it seems clear that Trump is trying to demonstrate to the Jordanian government just the extent of their reliance on the United States. But that Abdullah is very unlikely to respond belligerently to Israel, knowing that he would then forfeit US support and also would then be facing the US-backed Israeli military, but more that Abdullah would not be able to survive politically if his, as Marwan was saying, if Jordan faced the existential threat of hundreds of thousands, a million, however many Palestinians being forced across the border into Jordan, who would then insist that their government do something, and that Jordanians and Jordanians of Palestinian origin, neither of whom would be willing to simply accept this. And so the question is, could Abdullah and could the Hashemite government survive something like that? And I think the concern, as we were saying kind of at the opening, is that the United States may not be fully comprehending the level of the existential threat this would pose for Jordan and the kind of instability that would result, in particular thinking about the broader region, Lebanon obviously still reeling, experiencing current violence. Syria obviously in a very unstable position. Jordan has long been seen as this bastion of stability that the United States had invested significantly in maintaining. And so the question is the Trump administration willing to risk that? And are they fully comprehensive of what that would mean?
Let me pick up on your observations here, Annelle, and ask Bruce and Marwan whether they think that the Trump administration is serious about this, and whether they think, given the state of, say, politics in Jordan and politics in Israel, would the Israelis at the end of the day choose the option of an alternative homeland and pressing for that over maintaining a 1994 peace treaty that I think at this point has yielded something like 4 armored brigades on the Jordanian side of the river, basically closing the envelope, of the West Bank, which favors both Israeli and Jordanian current, security interests. I mean, that's kind of a strange choice that people are looking to make. So maybe I can turn to Marwan first and then Bruce on that.
I don't think, Steve, that the Trump administration has thought through the consequences of what they are at least, trying to aim at, transfer of Palestinians into Jordan. I don't think they have thought it through. In the end, $1.5 billion of assistance hardly will come against the existential threat that Jordan feels. And if Jordan is given a choice whether to accept Palestinians or to forego $1.5 billion of aid, I think the answer is very clear for Jordan. No amount of aid is going to stand up against what might be, as Annelle said, an internal stability problem that Jordan has no intention of facing. And so, in my view, the king is meeting with President Trump on February 11 now. And I think high, if not the highest on the king's priority list, is to explain to President Trump the consequences of his actions, not on the Palestinians only, but also on Jordan. And let's remember, I was ambassador to the United States when Bruce was at the White House, and we both can attest to this very strong security cooperation that Jordan and the US today have. To date, the US has 15 US bases in Jordan. which is not, not publicly known, but everybody knows that. We have a very strong security arrangement. And the relationship is so strong, not just with the White House, but with both sides of the aisle in Congress and with different components of US society. It is not that easy for President Trump to come and say, I'm going to cut off assistance to Jordan. That's not going to be, easily accepted, even by many Republicans in the House and the Senate. So I want to, I don't want to belittle the problem, but I also don't want us to think that just because President Trump made these statements, that Jordan is going to so easily accept them. That's, in my view, not going to happen. I want to go back, if I may, Steve, to your earlier question. I was spokesman of the Jordanian delegation to the Madrid peace talks. So I've been with the peace process since its inception. King Hussein actually was very hopeful. The Madrid peace process, he felt, allowed him to try this issue of arriving at a two-state solution that would, protect Jordan. He felt that he wasn't alone in going to Madrid. I mean, he was joined by the Syrians, by the Lebanese, and by the Palestinians. He developed a very strong relationship with Prime Minister Rabin. We tend to forget that. And together, even though Rabin never, ever talked about a Palestinian state, but the king felt that the negotiations and the relationship was going in such a direction that, that it might very well end with a two-state solution. That, of course, after Rabin was assassinated, that vanished. And King Hussein never had a good relationship with Netanyahu. And the same applies to, King Abdullah tried at first, but today the relationship is very bad. To the question of whether the Israelis care about the treaty or actually want a Palestinian, an alternative homeland, I think they made the choice. They have publicly said it. Netanyahu said publicly, a two-state solution is a reward for terrorism. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean if there is no two-state solution, does that mean he's going to make Palestinian citizens of Israel? I mean, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, is he going to make them citizens of Israel? Absolutely not. So what is the alternative there? If there is no two-state solution, the alternative is clear. And that's why, on one hand, Jordan is not going to sever the relation, the peace treaty is not going to abrogate it. I'm pretty sure of that. That's an international commitment Jordan will not withdraw back from. But on the other hand, I cannot imagine any kind of public cooperation other than the security cooperation that is going on. I cannot imagine any kind of public cooperation from now on with Israel, simply because official Jordan today does not trust what Israel intends to do.
Yeah. So, on this question of Jordanian attitudes towards the treaty, I mean, I'd have thought that regardless, it would be in Jordan's interest to keep this treaty alive, even if it's on life support, because it's really the only institutional barrier to Israeli or American initiatives for population transfers using Jordan for, say, the Gazan Palestinian population or part of it, or what have you. If I were Jordanian, I would hang on to that treaty as long as I could.
And that's what will happen, in my view.
I hope so.
Yes. I think
Bruce,
that's certainly the king's view.
Is he? Yeah. What's your impression, Bruce? Assuming you still track these things, and just out of general interest, of the competence, effectiveness, and reliability of Jordan's security forces, because things are going to get more fraught, clearly. So I was just wondering what your thinking was on that.
The Jordanian security forces, or let's be very explicit, the GID is the gold standard of international intelligence services. It is extremely good at penetrating terrorist plots aimed against the kingdom, aimed against the United States. Now, that doesn't diminish questions about its role in the internal affairs of Jordan. Certainly, there's lots of concerns there. But from the standpoint of partnership between the United States and Jordan on security issues, the intelligence part has always been at the forefront. Now, it doesn't get as much publicity for obvious reasons, but that is where it all begins. What's remarkable in the last decade or so is the development of conventional U.S. military force structure in Jordan, which Marwan talked about. That's a really new phenomenon. Let me also just briefly address the question of the Trump administration's attitudes towards Jordan. We know from the first Trump administration that Jordan was not a high priority. President made very clear from the beginning of his term in office that his priorities in the Middle East were number one, Saudi Arabia, and number two, Israel. And I suspect that will remain his priorities. And Jordan is not, it just doesn't carry the weight that attracts the Trumpers to support it. Now, Marwan very rightly pointed out that there's a lot of the rest of the American bureaucracy and political process that understands the importance of Jordan. Certainly the intelligence community, the Pentagon, CENTCOM, they all understand that. I would hope that our new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, understands that as well. But I don't think that the president has that kind of commitment to Jordan that we've seen, for example, in the Biden administration, in the Obama administration, and certainly in the Clinton administration, and even in the George W. Bush administration. It was the George W. Bush administration, if I remember correctly, that got the Jordan Free Trade Agreement put forward, which was a significant milestone in the development of this relationship. I would love to know more about the King's forthcoming visit to the White House. Who was pushing for this? My feeling is almost certainly the King was pushing for this. I'm doubtful that this was a high priority for the Trump White House.
I mean, I don't know the details, Bruce. All I can tell you is that during President Trump's first term, he only met with the King during his first year. And in his last 3 years, he did not meet with the King. And as as we all said, the relationship was not exactly what Jordan wanted to be. Right. I know that the King is keen to meet President Trump. I don't know who instigated. You could very well be right that we pushed for it. But what is significant is that this time he agreed to meet right. when he did not before. And that at least gives Jordan an opportunity to make its case about the consequences of such policies on the kingdom, not just on the Palestinians. Whether we are going to succeed at this or not, I don't know. I tend to agree that in this administration, maybe only two people that we can have a listening ear from are the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, Mike Hans. He is married to a Jordanian. That doesn't necessarily mean much, but he is married to a Jordanian American, which suggests that he will at least listen to what Jordan's concerns are.
Yes, yeah, we know that as President Clinton would have said, because it's a relative certainty. I had to think about that too the first time he said that. So let's stay on this topic of a summit meeting as some kind of encounter between King Abdullah and President Trump. Typically, when diplomats think about these kinds of meetings, and as they prepare for them, they think in terms of deliverables. So what's actually going to come out of this meeting, and what is each a principal going to come away with that he can point to, and he in this case that he can point to? What are they for Jordan and the United States if such a meeting came to pass? Over to you, Marwan.
Well, I think the king is going to deploy a policy that is not confrontational at one point. He has no intent to have a confrontational attitude with the president, just as the president think we did during his first term. And at the same time, he does not want to acquiesce to what Trump is suggesting about mass transfer. Ideally, Jordan needs to come out with two things: a statement by President Trump asserting Jordanian sovereignty and asserting the U.S. commitment to such sovereignty, and that they will not basically accept a violation of the treaty, and a continuation of U.S. aid. That is the ideal situation. If both objectives cannot be met, I think at least an assertion of Jordanian sovereignty is something that the king is going to be very keen on.
Bruce, what would these deliverables be for the Trump White House?
Well, I think in a delusional way, the president thinks he's going to convince King to take 1 million Gazans into Jordan. I think we all agree that that's absolutely not going to happen. In an ideal world, what should come from this summit is, first of all, the resumption of U.S. Assistance to Jordan, and maybe even a modest increase. It should also come up with some thoughts on what is going to be the future of Gaza. Right now, the future of Gaza is an unknown. The Israelis insist that they won't let Hamas run Gaza again, but they haven't come forward with any alternative for who should. The Jordanians obviously are not going to run Gaza, but they can be helpful in moving Palestinian Authority to be stronger and to be able to take place. They could also be willing to participate in an international peacekeeping force that goes into Gaza, which to my mind is the essential next step in this whole process. And we actually have Arab states saying that they are prepared to participate, including the UAE. And we have the largest Muslim state in the world, Indonesia, saying it's willing to participate. Now, that would make a lot of sense. The last deliverable that I think would be very helpful to come out of this is some agreement on how we're going to deal with the new government in Syria. This is a real opportunity in an otherwise pretty bleak picture. What's happened in Damascus in the last month or so is astounding. I certainly didn't expect that it would happen. I don't think very many people did. It's easy to be pessimistic about the future of Syria, and God knows there's good reasons to be pessimistic, but the United States and the Arab world should seize this opportunity to move Syria, if not to democracy, but at least out of the relationship it has had with Iran for the last 20, 30 years. This is a real chance to, let's see if we can develop a Syria that wants to be part of resolving conflict in the Middle East rather than supporting Hezbollah and instability in Lebanon.
I can see you haven't lost the hang of doing decision memos for the president. No, that was great, Bruce. We're going to turn to some questions from viewers. There's one that's for Annelle that I wanted to get to, from someone who spent significant time in Jordan in 2024, including covering the protests around the Khalidi Mosque. The crowd frequently chanted specifically about their disapproval of the Wadi Araba Treaty. That's the treaty we've been talking about. Can you speak to the difference between the official line on normalization in Jordan as compared to the widespread sentiments in the street? I think you can do that pretty crisply, but avoid expletives, okay? Watching.
The treaty with Israel has never been popular with Jordanians. Although I do think at this point, at least when I was there was some recognition of the concern of what an alternative might look like. There was another question that came up of someone expressed surprise that we haven't talked about the plan advanced to push the Hashemites out and make Jordan the Palestinian state. This is what we're talking about. I think this is the concern. And in particular, although Bruce outlined very reasonable and I think productive deliverables that the White House should be pushing for, I think the concern is that Trump and his administration are pushing for what they see as an alternative solution, this idea of Jordan as the alternative homeland. And what Marwan has stated emphatically several times is that this is existential for Jordan. And so I do think that we're likely to see these two leaders at a loggerheads, that Trump will insist that we're going to cut off aid. They already did cut off aid. And Barbara Slavin mentioned in the chat, what if the US imposes high tariffs on Jordanian goods? But as Marwan has said, no amount of aid or no amount of sort of economic pressure can overcome the existential threat that this would pose to Jordan. So I think another thing we haven't even brought up here is the Saudi factor, and the fact that we know that the so-called deal of the century that was put forward in the first Trump administration, which was sort of articulated in partnership with the Saudis, but not in partnership with the Jordanians, potentially involved the Saudis taking over custodianship of the Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, which is something that the Saudis have long desired as a means of consolidating their control over the major, obviously Mecca, Medina, and then Jerusalem as well, and fully, finally marginalizing the Hashemites, which although are far reduced from their previous status as the Sharifs of Mecca, remains sort of this alternative source of religious authority that the Saudis have never felt particularly comfortable with. Even, again, the fact that they rule a fairly small and impoverished country. So from the Saudi perspective, I think Jordan will be saying, look, Mohammed bin Salman has promised me $600 billion, and I'm going to try and get it to a trillion, despite the fact that the Saudi Public Investment Fund is only $930 billion in the first place. So there's really not that much money that MBS can throw around. But I think Trump would be asking, the Saudis have promised me this much investment. What are you, Jordan, going to promise me? And unfortunately, there's really not very much that Jordan can do for Trump from his perspective, other than accept Palestinians. And I don't know what sort of agreement or compromise could come out of a meeting between those two leaders.
I'm sorry, I just want to get to one or two other questions here, but one of them, this actually relates to something that you were just saying, Annelle, that you were addressing yourself to, and that's Barbara Slavin's question about, well, what happens, if the Trump administration says, hey, we've got the hammer and we've got the cupcake, which do you want? And if the Saudis are footing the bill for this in some administration conception, of a deal, then this number could be very high. It could be much higher than the 1.4 billion than Jordan gets from the United States. That number would be dwarfed, and at that point, would you have a public constituency in Jordan, especially on the Palestinian side of the body politic in Jordan, that says, well, maybe this is a good idea because we don't really have much else. And on the penalty side, I mean, the administration might regard there to be, say, no opportunity cost to punishing Jordan because, for example, Bruce mentioned that, well, we've got a lot of military installations, small military installations in Jordan that are a heritage of the war on terror. Well, President Trump has said that he's eager to pull the 2,000 troops that are now in Jordan for the Defeat ISIS mission, that are now in Syria for the Defeat ISIS mission, out of that country and redeploy them or bring them back home or something like that. I mean, he's very relaxed about the kinds of threats that have led to the, broad deployment of U.S. forces in Jordan. So, there may be bureaucrats who really see an importance to this, but the White House might not.
Last week, King Abdullah was in Brussels, and he got a commitment for $3 billion in EU aid for Jordan next year. Okay, $3 billion. So it is not that Jordan does not have any alternatives. It does. And it has a lot of respect in the international community. Again, I don't want to belittle US aid, but if anybody thinks that they can put US aid against the existential threat for Jordan, they are mistaken. No amount of aid is going to convince the king to say yes to President Trump. And the meeting does not need to end positively. It might not end positively. It's an opportunity for both sides to state their case. But in the end, if they don't agree, it does not mean that it is Jordan that has to pay the price. Jordan cannot pay the price, is what I'm saying.
That makes a lot of sense. Annelle, did I cut you off before? I'm not sure.
Well, I think just one other thing to keep in mind here, and perhaps this is, again, Bruce and Marwan and you, Steve, can speak to this with a lot more authority. But essentially what it seems like Trump is proposing with ethnically cleansing Palestinians from Gaza, from the West Bank to Egypt, as he says, to Jordan, as he says. I mean, we're essentially just rerunning a similar situation to what had happened after the creation of the State of Israel, where you had displaced Palestinians in other countries around the region. And not only those populations of Palestinians themselves trying to engage in acts of resistance, acts of violence, but also those countries being, the leadership facing popular resistance and outrage from their own populations, as well as this sense, obviously the Arab nationalism was stronger at the time, and there was the sense that the Arab countries needed to unite for the cause of Palestine. I mean, it seems that this is what Trump is setting up to do is to sort of reestablish that dynamic. And in many ways, for those who consider the Abraham Accords to have been a step forward, achieving normalization, countries being willing to sort of sidestep the Palestinian issue and normalize with Israel, it seems to me that Trump hasn't read the history and doesn't seem to understand that if he were to displace millions of Palestinians from historic Palestine, this would not result in some sort of peaceful resolution of this conflict. This would result in extreme instability and likely additional violence being directed against Israel. And maybe the assumption is that Israel can handle it, or would simply react with so much of its own violence, as we've observed, that this is seen as sort of a problem that they could manage. But again, Trump's whole thing is, as Steve mentioned, he doesn't want to devote additional US troops to the region. He doesn't want to devote a lot of additional attention to the region. He definitely doesn't want to get back into another war in the region. And it seems like what he's setting up for may be just that if he engages in this sort of a policy.
Well, that was an eloquent last word. Or maybe it's not a last word. We actually have 3 minutes and we have 3 panelists. So perhaps we could get a 1-minute summing up of each panelist's bottom line, starting with Marwan, then Bruce, and then back to Annelle.
Nobody has asked whether the Palestinians want to come from Gaza to Jordan. Okay, we just assume they are pawns that we can move around anytime we want to. It is very clear, they are not standing at the border with Egypt today. They are going back to their homes in North Gaza, even though knowing that their homes are not there. Palestinians have learned the lesson. They are not going to move. And so while we, engage in all these discussions, let's have that in mind as well.
Thank you. Bruce?
I think this summit between President and the King is going to be a very interesting one. And I think there's a good chance, as Marwan has stated, that there's not going to be a meeting of the minds. And the question then becomes where we go next. If there's a fundamental disagreement about this issue of clearing out Gaza, it's clear now that's the Trump plan for the future of Gaza. Empty it of people and turn it into a luxury beach complex. That's not the solution. That's not going to solve the problem. And as Marwan just pointed out, Gazans are not interested in leaving.
Thank you. Annelle, over to you.
I would echo that as well. I think the concern and part of what has motivated this is that unfortunately we have seen the complete breakdown in international law that has allowed Israel to engage in the genocide of Palestinians, such that what Palestinians want has been so beside the point as far as Israeli decision making, as far as American decision making. And I think the concern is clearly under the Biden White House, but also under the Trump White House, is that I think from the American and Israeli perspective is sort of the Palestinians will be forced to move or they will be killed. And I hope and what I think what will remain to be seen is how the other countries in the region react to this and either respond to what their own populations demand, which would be standing up for the cause of Palestinian sovereignty. But again, I think the concern is given the amount of military power that the US has used and that Israel has used, these countries will be faced with this existential question of try to stand up for Palestinians or face this extreme violence being turned against them.
Annelle, that was a fine summing up. Thank you very much, and thank you to Bruce and Marwan as well for their thoughtful comments, their candor, and wisdom. So hope we can do it again. Thanks all.